Good morning, friends. Now, concerning Sabbath, one thing we're going to run into time and again is the fact that it was instituted officially within the framework of the law that God gave to Moses, and thereby seems to be directly linked with the Old Covenant. And that is a significant consideration when we think about how the Sabbath should be considered within the New Covenant, because we are no longer in the Old, but the New. Therefore, we ask the question, how does the Sabbath affect us today? And that's a big question. And in my experience, it's generally asked in one of two ways. One way is the Sabbath for today? The other is something to the effect of, must we observe the Sabbath today? And of course, both questions drive at the same issue, but the questions themselves are different enough to betray a little bit of the preconception of the person asking those questions. Because if you ask, is the Sabbath for today? That likely indicates that you are concerned about that difference between the Old and New covenants. Does something instituted in the Old Covenant have any bearing on those who live in the New? Clearly, there are things in the law of Moses, like the ceremonial aspects of the law, that do not have bearing on us today, at least not in the physical way they were to be carried out in the original commands. Does the Sabbath fit into that category? And I really think that's a legitimate question, one I hope to get back to in the coming days. But the other way of asking the question is, must we observe the Sabbath today? And when people ask it that way, it makes me concerned for their understanding of the Sabbath itself and a seeming predisposition on their part to push back against something simply because it's required of them. Must we observe? Because as we've learned, the Sabbath was given entirely for the benefit of those who observed it. It offered rest from the only source that could actually provide true rest, God Himself. The Sabbath, in all those ways we talked about yesterday and on Sunday, it acted as a foundation for what kingdom living looks like. But when we ask the question to the effect of, must we observe the Sabbath day now in the New Covenant period, then the emphasis isn't so much on the benefit of the Sabbath, all those wonderful principles we've seen in it, and instead the focus becomes the requirement of the Sabbath. It becomes a legalistic take on the Sabbath from the get-go, which means it ends up being like a person who absolutely loves ice cream, but if someone were to tell them they had to eat ice cream, they'd resist simply because they had to, rather than saying, awesome, that's one command I'm eager to obey. And so, how we even consider the question of the Sabbath and how it relates to our Christian lives today, that can tell us about our preconceptions about the situation before we even truly get into the details of it. Are we honestly looking at the scriptures and saying, I just want to know how God wants me to live because He's good and I want to obey Him? Or is it fine? Tell me what I have to do to check things off a list. And that might seem like an unfair or too simplistic, breakdown of things. But really, I do think that regardless of how we phrase the question, with the words that come out of our mouths, those are pretty much the two mentalities that we can have. Do I want to approach the Sabbath because I truly want to know what's honoring to the Lord and what's beneficial for myself? Or do I want to know what's going on here so I can have that legalistic mindset and just do what I'm supposed to do and then check it off a list? Now, the other thing I want to mention today, as we prepare ourselves to consider more in depth just how the Sabbath does relate to us nowadays, and I want to look at that this week, of course, the thing I want to talk about now is the idea that God does not change. Okay, God does not change. In James 1:17, we read, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Also in Malachi 3:6, God Himself states simply, for I, the Lord, do not change. Now, what does this have to do with anything about the Sabbath? Well, it's not that nothing ever changes in terms of how God relates to His people. The simple fact that at one point God related to His people in terms of them being an earthly nation with physical boundaries and economy and military and so on, and now He relates to His people in terms of them being a church with its component parts scattered across the globe, well, that's evidence we're not talking about God not changing in that way in terms of how He relates to people. So what kind of change are we talking about when we understand that God does not change? Well, it's the fact that He does not change in terms of who He is. His nature does not change. His character does not change, and therefore his desires do not change. God does not desire one thing, then it appears that that's not going to pan out, so he changes his desires just that he desires something else. No, he does not change in anything like that. And that truth intersects with our consideration of the Sabbath because God had a certain motivation, a certain desire in giving Moses the law to give to the rest of the people. Because the law was, as we've learned in the past, a reflection itself of the nature of God. If you really want to get to know God, even today, read his law, and you will see his love, his grace, his mercy, his justice, his wrath, and so on. And as such, you will see principles in God's law that do not change, regardless of what time period you live in, because those principles come out of who God is, and God does not change. That is why, to go back to an example we used in the past, in Deuteronomy 22:8, we read, "When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, that you may not bring the guilt of blood upon your house if anyone should fall from it." You see, the command was given because the houses of ancient Israel, at least once they had permanent houses rather than tents, would have flat roofs. And they would spend time up there in the evenings, especially. It would be the coolest place to be. And so God demonstrates his love for people in commanding that parapets, or essentially railings, must be built around the top of the house to protect people from falling off. And people might be inclined to say, well, that law doesn't apply to us anymore. It's ridiculous. We have pitched roofs, not flat roofs, so it doesn't apply to us. Okay, well, the circumstances may have changed, but did the principle that the law was based on change? Did God's love for or concern for protecting life change? Of course not. And so we may not put railings on our roofs because we don't spend any time up there, but if you have a second-story balcony, don't you put a railing on that? Wouldn't that be in line with the unchanging principle of Deuteronomy 22:8? Of course it would. And now to get back to the issue at hand, to finally land this plane at the point of the Sabbath, in Exodus 31:12, God says to Moses, "You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, 'Above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations,'" and so on. Now, I'm not saying that no change can happen concerning the Sabbath and how we observe it. Again, as I mentioned, based on Romans 14, there can be room for different understandings that lead to different applications as to how the Sabbath is observed today, just as there are different applications regarding roof safety for us today than for them in that historical context back then. But what seems so very clear to me is that God establishes as one of those unchanging principles is that the issue of the Sabbath is incredibly important. He says, "Speak to the people of Israel and say, 'Above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths.'" I mean, we're given to understand that as God says this to Moses, Moses is prepared to go back down off Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments, those 2 tablets of stone, literally in hand, to give the whole law to the nation of Israel. And God's last instructions are not, "Do not murder," or "Do not covet." They're not even, "Do not have any other gods before me." No, God says, "Above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths." Above all. Friends, the reality of the Sabbath and all of the Sabbath signifies, it's incredibly important to God. Are we going to then say that God's desires, his motivations, the driving force of his own good and perfect will have changed since then? I don't see how we could possibly go down that road because God does not change. And again, forgive me for being redundant. If I am, I just want to press this home. I'm not saying that the way we observe the Sabbath can't change. Because even in my view that we should observe the principles of the Sabbath on a certain day of the week, even in saying that, I admit to changes in how that plays out, since we observe those principles on Sunday, the Lord's Day, rather than Saturday, which was the original Sabbath. So, yet, no matter whether you believe that, or you believe that the Sabbath is fulfilled simply through faith in Christ, we're dealing with changes in how the Sabbath principles are applied and how they're demonstrated today. But what I want to impress upon you right now is that no matter which view you take, or whatever other view that might best fit your understanding, we had better not take this matter lightly, because it is incredibly important to God, and he makes it abundantly clear. I mean, throughout the Old Testament, he judges his people as an entire nation for how they profane and fail to keep the Sabbath. He eventually sends them into exile because they profane and fail to keep the Sabbath for so long. And so may these things that we've discussed this morning, may they just act as a focal point for us for our future discussion on what we do with those Sabbath principles today. No matter what understanding we end at, let's make sure that we are truly trying to understand, that we are striving for a correct understanding, and we just don't take the whole issue and say it's of no account. It's not really that important, because clearly the principles of Sabbath were incredibly important to God in the days of Moses, throughout the time of the Old Testament nation of Israel as well, and it must be important to him today as well, because he does not change. I love you guys. Have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I will see you soon.